So we're picking up in chapter 27 with the home front, mobilizing for total war. So in August 1914, people welcomed war. Ordinary people in every country were excited, and they believed that their nation was right in defending themselves against foreign aggression. And of course, they were faced with the need for more men and more weapons all the time to keep the war machine going. And so national leaders aggressively intervened in society and the economy to make this happen. And every state pretty much established new government ministries or organizations to mobilize soldiers and armaments, and even to provide care for war widows and wounded veterans. There were also censorship offices that were put into place to control the news about the course of the war. Government planning boards set mandatory production goals. They established rationing programs and even set limits on wages and prices, which, though it invaded the people's right to make their own decisions in some cases, it did create a really productive industrial economy in many places that yielded effective war efforts. Germany by far went the furthest in developing a planned economy. The whole economy was set up to wage total war, and it began with the establishment of the War Raw Materials Board. And the War Raw Materials Board rationed and distributed raw materials. They also launched successful attempts to protect substitutes like synthetic rubber and synthetic nitrates that were used to make explosives. Germany did not, though, tax the war profits of private firms heavily enough, and so they ended up with massive deficit financing, inflation, the growth of the black market, and eventually the reemergence of class conflict. And then after the terrible battles of Verdun and Somme in 1916, Germany enacted the Auxiliary Service Law, and it required all men to work only at jobs considered critical to the war effort. So war production increased. All the while, some Germans were living on a little more than 1,000 calories a day, and many of them starved to death. And in 1917, with the support of this new, super conservative pro-war Fatherland Party, Generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff established a military dictatorship, and they called for the ultimate mobilization for total war. And so this was history's first totalitarian society. Only Germany, though, was ruled directly by a military government. But the leaders in all belligerent nations did take some power from Parliament. They did suspend some civil liberties, and they did ignore some democratic procedures in order to mobilize for war. So the social impact. So national conscription, or the draft, sent millions of men to the front. And this exposed many people to foreign lands for the first time in their lives. So that was a big social change for a lot of people. Also, the need for workers on the home front meant greater power and prestige for labor unions, and the participation of labor leaders in important decision and policy making at even the government level. The role of women changed dramatically as large number of women entered the workforce, and not only entered the workforce, but into skilled industrial jobs, which were long considered men's work only. There were women who found jobs as bank tellers and mail carriers and police officers, firefighters, and even farm laborers. And so the war really expanded the range of women's activities and helped to change attitudes about gender. And this culminated in many countries granting women the right to vote immediately after the war, including the United States. Women's employment gains were temporary, though, because most of the soldiers who came back demanded their jobs back after the war was over. And so governments forced women out of the workplace. To some extent, war did promote a greater social equality between men and women and between classes. It blurred class distinctions, and also lessen the gap between rich and poor. In general, European society became more uniform and egalitarian, which was reflected in full employment and rationing according to physical needs. And of course, the sharing of hardships, which bound people together as never before. Even death on the battlefield did not make class distinctions. There were young aristocratic leaders or generals or officers who were taken, and there were, drafted peasants and unskilled workers who died as well. So really, this sense of common hardship brought people together and unified them. So growing political tensions. So during the beginning of the war, the first 2 years of war, patriotic nationalism and the belief that their nation would come out on top united peoples behind their national leaders. Each government did use censorship and propaganda, of course, patriotic posters and slogans and slanted news and biased editorials in order to inflame national hatreds toward the foreigners and to control public opinion and to bolster popular support. But by the spring of 1916, people were beginning to crack under the strain of total war. They were sick of war and they were ready for it to be over. On May 1st of 1916, several thousand demonstrators in Berlin gathered to hear the radical socialist leader Karl Liebknecht attack the costs of the war effort. And although he was immediately arrested, his very daring action ignited strikes and protest marches pretty much on every home front, not just Germany. In April, then just the next month in 1916, Irish nationalists in Dublin revolted against British rule. But a week after bitter fighting, of course, the rebels were crushed and their leaders were executed. In France, Clemenceau had to establish a virtual dictatorship, jailing journalists and politicians who dared to suggest a compromise peace with Germany. And on all sides, soldiers' morale began to decline. There were numerous French units that refused to fight after the disastrous French offensive on May of 1917. There were Russian soldiers who deserted in droves, and the Italian army collapsed in despair after the Battle of Caporetto in 1917. In France, there was a new general, Henry Philippe Pétain, who was able to restore order within the French forces. But really, it was only the promised arrival of fresh, new United States troops that stiffened the resolve of the British and the French to keep on fighting. These strains were even worse for the Central Powers. There was political dissatisfaction and conflicts among nationalists that grew in spite of the fact that there was absolute censorship and propaganda and things like that. In Austria, the Emperor Francis Joseph died in 1916, and with him went the symbol of unity. And so the Czechs and the Yugoslav leaders demanded independent states for their people. And Germans on the home front suffered as well. There was a scarcity of food, and there were rationing plans that were really very poorly implemented, and it resulted in 750,000 German civilians starving to death. So the nationalist unity that existed in the first year of the war collapsed majorly as a growing minority of socialists or moderate socialists caused for a compromise, a peace without annexations or reparations. Let's just stop fighting. And so in early 1917, Germany experienced a surge in revolutionary agitation and strikes by war-weary workers who, again, their job in life at this point was just to fuel the German war machine or the war effort. So militaristic Germany, just like Austria-Hungary and even their enemy France, were really beginning to crack in 1917. And we'll go ahead and end there, and we'll pick up with the Russian Revolution in the next video.